Inside the forgotten hills of eastern Kentucky, wherein morning mist nonetheless clings to valleys that time seems to have deserted, there exists a documented case that has perplexed historians for almost 2 centuries. In 1834, the Reverend Ezekiel Morrison and his 9 12 months vintage dual daughters, Rebecca and Rachel, arrived at the far-flung Baptist congregation of Pinehole, a network so isolated that maps of the era slightly acknowledged its existence. What came about at some point of their 3-day life turned into meticulously recorded within the private magazine of Pastor William Phillips, a document discovered in 1987, whilst the antique church turned into, in the end, demolished. The journal entries describe activities so specific, so unnaturally correct that present-day psychologists have studied them notably. But none can provide an explanation for how 2 young children ought to own knowledge that rejected every rational explanation. The Morrison twins did not just predict destiny occasions. They found out secrets buried for decades, defined humans that they had never met, and noted tragedies that occurred years before their delivery. But perhaps maximum unsettling of all, every single element they discovered proved to be in reality verifiably real. This channel is not for all people, handiest for those brave enough to confront mysteries that assignment our knowledge of fact itself. Before we dive deeper into the Morrison case, make sure you are subscribed, because we're approximately to uncover information that most historians refuse to discuss. And tell us in the remarks, what country are you listening from? Because what befell in Kentucky would possibly have came about toward your own home than you suspect. The story begins not with the supernatural, however with something a ways extra unsettling. The possibility that a few human minds can get entry to information in ways technology nevertheless can't recognize. The Kentucky of 1834 changed into a land caught between barren region and civilization, wherein communities like Pine Hollow existed in virtual isolation most of the Cumberland foothills. This particular agreement were mounted in 1818 by using 3 households in search of non-secular freedom far away from the denominational conflicts plaguing large town. By the time the Morrison circle of relatives arrived, Pine Hollow consisted of barely 200 souls, most associated by blood or marriage, all sure by way of the strict Baptist doctrine that ruled each component in their day-by-day lives. The community centered around a modest timber church, built with their personal fingers, using timber from the surrounding hill. Pastor William Phillips, a learned guy who had deserted his relaxed existence in Lexington to serve those frontier souls, maintained the most effective written information of births, deaths, marriages, and huge activities. His meticulous nature could prove vital in documenting what turned into approximately to unfold. Ezekiel Morrison turned into a acquainted determine along the circuit of far-flung church buildings scattered at some point of the Appalachian area. Tall and weathered with prematurely gray hair that stated hardships beyond his 34 years. He traveled walking along with his daughters, carrying only a worn leather-based satchel containing his Bible, a few private gadgets, and the magazine in which he recorded his religious observations. He had been widowed for 9 years, ever considering his wife Sarah died giving delivery to the twins at some stage in a terrible iciness typhoon that had isolated their cabin for weeks. The girls, Rebecca and Rachel, have been striking in their equal look, but absolutely extraordinary in temperament. Rebecca, born first by way of mere mins, possessed an outgoing nature that drew human beings to her without delay. Her smile became infectious, her laughter genuine, and she spoke with the self-assurance of someone some distance older. Rachel, quieter and extra observant, appeared to exist in her sister's shadow. But those who regarded intently observed that she frequently commenced sentences that Rebecca might finish, or answered questions directed at her sister earlier than Rebecca had a hazard to reply. What made the Morrison-owned family especially noteworthy? Many of the circuit preachers became Ezekiel's popularity for bringing non-secular renewal to struggling congregations. Tales accompanied them from church to church. Testimonies of backsliders returning to faith, of groups resolving long-status conflicts, of non-secular awakenings that lasted for years after their departure. A few attributed this to Ezekiel's passionate preaching. However, individuals who determined greater cautiously noticed that the actual adjustments frequently started out after personal conversations with the twins. The journey to Pine Hollow were especially hard. Lady autumn rains had turned the mountain paths into treacherous dust, and Ezekiel were forced to carry Rachel for the final 5 miles while she developed a fever. They arrived at sundown on November 15, 1834, just as Pastor Phillips turned into concluding evening prayers, with the handful of congregants who attended week and nighttime services. Phillips later wrote that his first influence of the circle of relatives turned into considered one of profound weariness, no longer just physical, but non-secular. Ezekiel's clothes had been traveled and patched, his boots worn thin from countless miles of mountain paths. The girls clung close to their father. Rachel still faded from her fever, Rebecca's common brightness dimmed through exhaustion. Yet something of their eyes, an alert that regarded inappropriate for kids their age, made Philip's experience inexplicably uneasy. The congregation of Pine Hole had extended hospitality to many visiting preachers over the years, but there has been something distinctive about the Morrisons from the very beginning. That first night, because the own family shared a simple meal with the Phillips family, Rebecca asked the pastor's wife approximately her lawn, particularly inquiring whether the roses by way of the Jap fence had recovered from the blight that almost killed them 3 summers in the past. Mrs. Phillips had dropped her spoon, looking at the kid in amazement. The rose blight had certainly passed off 3 years previous, devastating her prized flower lawn, but had become now not something she had stated to absolutely everyone out of doors the immediately network. Whilst pressed, Rebecca virtually smiled and said she had dreamed approximately roses at the same time as walking, and by hook or by crook knew that Mrs. Phillips grew the most lovely ones within the county. This incident, recorded in Pastor Phillips's journal, that very night would show to be merely the first of many that might mission the whole thing. The Pine Hole Network believed about the herbal global. The subsequent morning dawned gray and cold with a bitter wind that rattled the windows of the small cabin in which the Morrison circle of relatives had been given safe haven. Pastor Phillips rose early, as become his custom, to put together for the day's sermon. He located Ezekiel, already conscious, sitting through the death embers of the hearth, his Bible open, however his eyes staring into the gap with an expression of deep challenge. The ladies had annoying goals final nighttime, Ezekiel explained when Phillips inquired approximately his afflicted demeanor. They often dream of the places we are going to visit. However, these goals had been one of a kind, darker. Earlier than Phillips ought to reply, Rebecca appeared in the doorway, her hair raveled from sleep, however her eyes alert and targeted. "Pastor Phillips," she said in her clean childish voice, "for your church, underneath the 1-3 floorboard from the altar, there's something hidden that shouldn't be there." Rachel dreamed about it, and that I dreamed approximately why it's hidden. The pastor felt a sit back that had nothing to do with the morning air. He had indeed hidden something under the 1 specific floorboards, a bottle of whiskey that represented his ongoing struggle with temptation. Not a soul knew approximately it. He had located it there at some stage in a second of week, 0.3 months previous, telling himself it changed into better to hold it near, where he could withstand it daily, in preference to put off the temptation absolutely. It became a mystery that shamed him deeply, one he had confessed best to God in his personal prayers. "What precisely did you dream, baby?" Phillips asked, his voice barely constant. Rachel emerged from the shadows in the back of her sister, transferring with that unusual silent grace that regarded to symbolize her every motion. "The bottle is brown," she said softly, "and it's wrapped in a piece of fabric that used to be a child's blanket, a blue blanket." Phillips sank into his chair as if his legs should not guide him. The cloth was indeed a remnant of an infant blanket. The blanket that would have belonged to the son he and his spouse had misplaced in infancy 5 years in advance. He had wrapped the bottle in it as a reminder of his failures, each as a father who could not keep his toddler, and as a pastor who could not conquer his very own weaknesses. Ezekiel watched his host's reaction with an expression that combined sympathy with a weary familiarity. It commenced when they had been very younger, he defined quietly. "At first I notion it changed into simply infantile intuition, The manner younger ones on occasion sense matters adults leave out. But as they grew older, their insights became extra specific, extra impossible to provide an explanation for via natural way. That Sunday provider might be remembered via each member of the Pinehole congregation for the rest of their lives. Ezekiel's sermon changed into effective, but common for a circuit preacher, a passionate name for non-secular renewal and confession of sins. It changed into what happened afterward that confounded all rationalization. As the congregation commenced to file out, Rebecca approached Samuel Turner, a wealthy farmer recognized for his generosity to the church and his standing inside the community. She appeared up at him with her harmless blue eyes and stated, "Mr. Turner, the money you've been taking from the church collection isn't surely stealing in case you put it back, is it? Papa says God forgives folks that repent." The color drained from Turner's face. For 6 months, he had been skimming small amounts from the collection plate to cowl debts from a failed funding in a Louisville commercial enterprise project. He had informed himself he would replace each penny once his economic state of affairs advanced. But the lacking money were consuming at his sense of right and wrong like a cancer. Before Turner could respond, Rachel moved to stand beside her sister and addressed Martha Whitfield, the elderly widow who served as the church's unofficial ethical authority. "Mrs. Whitfield, your husband did not die in the farming accident, did he? He's nevertheless alive somewhere, and that's why you hide the letters." The aged woman swayed as though she may faint. Her husband had indeed deserted her and their kids 15 years in advance, taking their savings and disappearing one nighttime without rationalization. She had fabricated the tale of his accidental death to keep her dignity and her children's future in the network. The letters Rachel cited had been the occasional correspondence she obtained from him pleading for forgiveness and describing his new life in Missouri. She had never spoken of them to every person. One after the other, the twins moved via the congregation, talking quietly to numerous individuals, to Dr. Hayes. They stated patients who had died beneath his care due to his loss of right clinical training. To the Miller circle of relatives, they spoke knowingly of the son they stored hidden in their attic, a younger guy whose simple mind made them ashamed before their friends. To young Thomas Brett, they defined in detail his mystery meetings with Elizabeth Carter, the married woman whose husband traveled often on commercial enterprise. Each revelation changed into brought with childlike innocence, without judgment or malice, as if the ladies have been certainly sharing observations approximately the weather. Yet the accuracy of their statements turned into so precise, so impossible that the congregation stood frozen in an aggregate of terror and awe. Pastor Phillips watched in horrified fascination as his orderly community became inside out, through 9-year antique children, who said secrets and techniques that have to have been recognized simplest to God. However, it turned into Rebecca's final declaration that might haunt him for the rest of his days. She walked to the front of the church, stood before the altar, and placed her small hand at the wood cross that had been carved via the church's founding individuals. "This is sacred floor," she stated, her voice wearing without a doubt through the silent sanctuary. "However, it's been stained by what came about right here before. The Whitman circle of relatives didn't die in a house here, did they, Pastor Phillips? They died proper right here on this very room, and a number of you recognize precisely why. The silence that accompanied became deafening. Even the wind outdoors seemed to have stilled, as if nature itself turned into watching for a person to reply to this not possible accusation. The revelation approximately the Whitman circle of relatives struck the congregation like a physical blow. Pastor Phillips, his face faded as morning frost, gripped the pulpit so tightly his knuckles went white. The Whitman tragedy became Pine Hollow's deepest mystery, a wound that had never nicely healed despite 16 years of collective silence. In 1818, whilst Pine Hollow becomes still a struggling agreement of barely 50 souls, the Whitman own family had been amongst its most distinguished members. Jacob Whitman served as both blacksmith and unofficial chief, whilst his wife Mary became known for her talent with herbal remedies and her gentle manner with tough birth. Their twin daughters, Hope and Religion, have been the community's darlings, vibrant, beautiful 9-year-old girls who sang in the church choir. and helped their mom have a tendency to the sick. The authentic tale, the only recorded in Pastor Phillips's predecessors' carefully maintained information, stated that the Whitman-owned family had perished in a tragic house fire throughout a wintry weather hurricane. Their bodies were located in their homes' remains, and that they were buried inside the church cemetery with appropriate rite. The community mourned, rebuilt, and moved ahead as frontier groups had been compelled to do whilst tragedy struck. But Rebecca's announcement counseled a far unique truth, one which numerous of the older congregation individuals had hoped could stay buried all the time. Elder Thompson, now 73 and one among Pine Hollow's founding families, slowly rose from his pew. His arthritis made motion painful, but his voice carried the load of many years when he finally spoke. Infant, he stated, his phrases measured and cautious. You communicate of things that passed off earlier than you were born in locations you have by no means been. How may want to you likely realize approximately what you declare to recognize? Rebecca turned to stand him, her blue eyes retaining an unsettling maturity. Religion Whitman had a birthmark on her left shoulder, she said quietly. Desire had one on her right ankle. Religion continually carried a wood doll that their father carved, and Desire wore a silver locket with their mom's hair interior. When they died, Religion became wearing her blue Sunday get-dressed, and Hope became in her nighttime gown because she had been sick with fever. Those information, not possible for a stranger to recognize, sent a murmur of recognition via the older contributors of the congregation. Elder Thompson's spouse clutched his arm, her eyes wide with popularity and fear. The night they died, Rachel endured, her voice smooth but clean. It wasn't a house fire that killed them. They came to the church looking for sanctuary because someone turned into searching them. They concealed behind the altar, but they had been discovered besides. The church had grown so quiet that the sound of respiratory seemed unnaturally loud. Pastor Phillips observed himself remembering fragments of conversations he had heard through the years, whispered phrases that stopped while he entered a room, significant glances between the older members while sure topics arose. The manner a few families always left flowers at an unmarked spot within the cemetery. Samuel Turner, nevertheless shaken with the aid of the sooner revelation about his monetary transgressions, stood up unexpectedly. That is madness, he declared, though his voice lacked conviction. Those youngsters are talking nonsense, making up stories to frighten us. There may be no way they may recognize such matters, but at the same time as he spoke, other details commenced rising from the congregation. Mrs. Carter, Elizabeth's mom in regulation, whispered something approximately bloodstains that had appeared on the church ground years later, stains that couldn't be wiped clean regardless of how difficult they scrubbed. Vintage Benjamin Foster referred to the peculiar sounds that occasionally echoed from the church overdue at nighttime. Seems like kids crying, that were disregarded as wind through the freeboards. Dr. Hayes, no matter his in advance embarrassment approximately his scientific qualifications, found himself talking up with clinical precision. I have constantly puzzled approximately the church's foundation, he said slowly. When I helped repair the eastern wall 3 years ago, we observed what seemed like, well, what might have been bone fragments combined with the unique mortar. The consequences of his announcement hung heavy inside the air. If the Whitman family had indeed died inside the church, if their bodies have been secretly interred within its very foundations, then every carrier, every prayer, every second of worship had taken place over their unmarked grave. Ezekiel Morrison had been standing silently during these revelations, his weathered face displaying deep challenge, however no surprise. He had witnessed comparable scenes in different communities, watched as his daughter's not possible expertise unraveled, carefully maintained lies, and brought lengthy buried truths into the mild. Mr. Morrison, Pastor Phillips stated, his voice strained. How do your daughters realize this stuff? What way of gift lets in them such insight? Ezekiel became quiet for a long second, studying the faces of the congregation earlier than responding. I have requested myself that question each day for years, he subsequently stated. Their mother, Sarah, claimed to have the second sight, the potential to experience things past everyday belief. But what the girls experience goes some distance beyond something Sarah ever tested. They dream of locations, they've by no means seen. Talk of human beings they have got in no way met. No details about activities that came about earlier than their delivery. He paused, searching at his daughters with a mixture of love and profound sadness. At first, I thought it was a blessing, a divine present that might assist me minister to distressed souls. However, through the years, I have begun to wonder if it is something else completely. The knowledge they possess, it comes with a cost. They convey the burden of all people's secrets and techniques, all people's ache. They recognize things youngsters ought to by no means need to recognize. As though summoned by their father's words, the twins moved to face collectively on the front of the church. For the first time considering that their arrival, they looked in reality just like the children they have been, small, inclined, and crushed by way of the adult international swirling round them. "We do not choose what we see," Rebecca said. Her earlier self-belief replaced via weariness that regarded a ways too antique for her younger face. "The dreams come whether we want them or now not. We see what become, what is, and sometimes what will be." Rachel nodded, her hand finding her sister's. "The Whitman sisters visit our desires on occasion. They need humans to understand what definitely passed off to them. They want someone to consider them well." The church fell silent once more. However, this time it changed into the silence of humans grappling with standards that challenged their essential information of reality. Some faces confirmed skepticism, others fear, and nonetheless others redecorating hope that possibly dying turned into not the very last finishing they had usually believed it to be. Pastor Phillips found himself at a crossroads that might define the relaxation of his ministry. He could disregard the twins' claims as childish fantasy or deliberate deception, maintaining the network's carefully maintained balance, or he ought to pursue the reality, irrespective of in which it led, and hazard destroying the rules upon which Pine Hollow have been constructed. The selection could prove to have outcomes that none of them should have anticipated. That evening, as shadows lengthened across Pine Hole's narrow streets, Pastor Phillips determined himself not able to pay attention on his typical night prayers. The twins' revelations had shaken him to his center, now not simply because of their accuracy. However, due to the fact they'd pressured him to confront questions he had been warding off for years. He had arrived at Pine Hole 5 years earlier, eager to serve God in the wilderness, and to escape the theological controversies that plagued the greater established churches in Kentucky's larger cities. His predecessor, Pastor Maury Hayes, had left in the back of meticulous information of births, deaths, and sizable occasions. However, Phillips had always observed gaps inside the documentation from the settlement's earliest year. The wintry weather of 1818 specifically regarded oddly sparse and recorded info. There were entries about harsh weather, deliver shortages, and the deaths of several elderly citizens. However, the Whitman circle of relatives' tragedy became mentioned most effective and brief. Jacob Whitman, his spouse Mary, and their twin daughters Desire and Faith perished in a house here on the night of December 21st. Their earthly stays have been committed to the ground with appropriate Christian rite. What had usually struck Phillips as bizarre changed into the lack of detail, approximately one of these widespread occasions. Pastor Hayes had been thorough in his documentation of even minor incidents. Yet the loss of life of a whole circle of relatives, in particular one as prominent as the Whitmans, had been recorded with uncommon brevity. Decided to recognize what the Morrison twins may have exposed, Phillips started looking through the church's saved facts with new eyes, hidden below years of gathered files. He determined a small leather magazine he had in no way seen before. The pages have been water-stained and fragile. However, the handwriting turned into genuinely Pastor Hayes's very own. What Phillips studied via candlelight that night time could change his information of Pine Hollow's records forever. Officially, these disappearances had been attributed to herbal dangers, bears, falls, publicity to harsh climate. But if Jacob Whitman had determined evidence that a few tourists had been deliberately murdered and robbed, the church became built with blood money, Rebecca continued, her young voice carrying a weight of knowledge that ought to have been impossible at her age. It's why faith and wish cannot rest. Their blood became spilled on ground that become already cursed. Phillips determined himself face to face with a reality greater horrible than something he had imagined, the church he had dedicated himself to serving. The sanctuary where he had prayed for guidance and luxury were constructed with the proceeds of homicide and had itself come to be the website of even extra violence. But while he grappled with those revelations, part of his thoughts remained analytical, thinking how could he confirm any of this? How may want to he distinguish between supernatural information and in difficult deception? The solution could come sooner than he anticipated, and from a source that would task every rational clarification he might have built. The next morning delivered an unexpected traveler to Pine Hollow. As the Morrison circle of relatives organized for their departure, their deliberate 3-day live having already been extended to deal with Sunday's dramatic revelations, a lone horseman approached the agreement from the Jap Trail. The rider turned into a person in his 50s, properly dressed within the way of town, folks with a bearing that advised training and authority. He introduced himself to Pastor Phillips as Thomas Brennan, a solicitor from Lexington, who had been attempting to find facts about occasions in Pine Hollow dating lower back to its founding years. "I constitute the property of one Marcus Webb," Brennan explained as he commended Phillips's hospitality. "Mr. Webb died these days in Louisville, and amongst his outcomes, we found documents suggesting he had enterprise dealings with this network in its early years. I'm attempting to hint the disposition of sure funds which can have been irregularly transferred." Phillips felt his blood sit back. Marcus Webb turned into a call that had appeared in Pastor Hayes's secret journal. One and all several vacationers who had disappeared alongside the mountain paths in 1818 and 1819. In keeping with Hayes's notes, Webb were carrying a huge amount of cash meant for land purchases in Tennessee. Earlier than Phillips may want to formulate a response, Rebecca seemed at his elbow with that uncanny timing that characterized so many of her appearances. She regarded up at Brennan with curious eyes and stated, "Mr. Webb had a gold watch together with his initials engraved inside the cover. It had a crack throughout the crystal, due to the fact he dropped it while he fell from his horse." Brennan's composure cracked visibly. "How ought to you in all likelihood recognize approximately Marcus Webb's watch?" he demanded. That detail changed into stated best in his personal correspondence with his brother. Rachel materialized beside her sister as though summoned with the aid of some invisible sign. "The watch is buried at the back of the church," she stated quietly. "Along together with his cash bag and his horse's bridle, Elder Thompson put them there after. What passed off on the path? The consequences struck Phillips like a physical blow. If the twins had been accurate, if Marcus Webb's private effects had been indeed buried behind the church, it might show that their knowledge extended some distance past what any normal infant could own. Greater importantly, it'd provide tangible proof of the crimes that had funded Pine Hollow's early improvement. Brennan dismounted his horse with pressing cause. "I demand that we excavate the vicinity immediately," he declared. "If what those kids claim is true, we're looking at evidence of robbery and murder." Elder Thompson, who were watching the exchange from a distance, approached with obvious reluctance. At 73, he changed into the most effective surviving member of the authentic management council that had made the decisions in those early years. His weathered face confirmed a mixture of resignation and defiance. "You talk of things you do not recognize, stranger," Thompson said, his voice carrying the authority of age and function. "This community changed into constructed via God-fearing individuals who did what they needed to do to continue to exist within the wilderness. Survival would not justify murder." Brennan responded sharply. "If those allegations are real, this entire settlement become founded on criminal acts." Rebecca seemed up at Elder Thompson with those unsettling blue eyes that regarded to peer a long way an excessive amount of. "Mr. Thompson," she stated gently, "the nightmares stopped coming after the primary year, didn't they? You informed yourself that supposed God had forgiven you." Thompson's facade crumbled visibly. "Baby," he whispered, "you couldn't recognize about. No person knows about approximately the goals wherein Marcus Webb begged you to let him move," Rachel continued, her tender voice carrying definitely within the morning air. "About the way you see his face every night earlier than you doze off." The vintage guy sank onto a nearby tree stump as if his legs should no longer aid him. It wasn't purported to manifest, he stated, his voice breaking. "We best supposed to take the money. We have been ravenous. Our youngsters have been unwell and wintry weather changed into coming." However, Webb fought again, after which his confession hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pea. Pastor Phillips realized he'd become witnessing the unraveling of everything he had believed. Approximately his community, his church, and his faith. Ezekiel Morrison, who were standing silently via those revelations, subsequently spoke. "The reality has a way of surfacing," he stated quietly. "My daughters don't pick what they reveal. They are simply conduits for statistics that needs to be heard." Brennan wasted no time in organizing an excavation birthday party. Inside hours, numerous guys from the network were digging in the back of the church, guided through the twins' unique instructions. Pastor Phillips watched with developing dread, understanding that every shovel full of earth brought them toward proof that could break Pine Hollow's cautiously built mythology. They didn't have to dig deep. 3 feet below the surface, their shovel struck something metallic. Carefully brushing away the soil, they uncovered a tarnished gold pocket watch. Its crystals certainly cracked, as Rebecca had defined. The initials MW had been virtually visible inside the cap. Beside the watch lay a leather cash bag, its contents lengthy due to the fact that deteriorated, however its presence plain. The pony's bridle, although rotted by using years of burial, becomes still recognizable for what it was. Brennan tested each item with the methodical precision of a man accustomed to building felony instances. "This watch suits the description in Marcus, Internet's correspondence exactly," he introduced. "The crack throughout the crystal, the engraving, even the uncommon chain hyperlink. Everything is precisely as his brother described it." But it turned into Elder Thompson's response that supplied the maximum damning confirmation. The antique guy stared at the recovered items with the expression of a person seeing ghosts, his lips moving in what could have been prayer or confession. "There were others," he stated in the end, his voice barely audible. "Internet wasn't the primary, and he wasn't the final. The trail through those mountains became ideal for what we had to." Tourists came through often, generally on my own, frequently carrying cash for land deals or enterprise ventures. The scope of the crimes becoming clean. Pine Hole hadn't been constructed through hard work and divine windfall. It had been financed through a scientific marketing campaign of theft and murder that had lasted for years. However, while the evidence installed, Phillips observed himself grappling with questions that transcended the instant crimes. How should the Morrison twins realize details that no living man or woman have to possess? How could they describe sufferers they'd never met? Crimes that had occurred before their delivery? Places of proof that had been hidden for decades. The solutions could show extra annoying than any rational explanation he would possibly have constructed. And they would pressure him to confront the opportunity. That loss of life turned into not the finishing he had usually believed it to be, because the sun set over Pine Hole that nighttime, casting lengthy shadows across the excavation website and the church cemetery beyond. Phillips realized that his community stood at a crossroads, the reality become in the end rising after 16 years of careful concealment. However, with it came questions that challenged the whole thing they had been taught to agree with, about justice, redemption, and the nature of fact itself. The Morrison twins stood collectively inside the developing darkness, their small figures silhouetted in opposition to the church that were constructed with blood cash and consecrated with innocent blood. They seemed to be paying attention to something only they might pay attention. Their faces became in the direction of the cemetery, where such a lot of secrets and techniques lay buried under unmarked graves. Day after today would deliver reckoning, but tonight belonged to the dead, who had in the end discovered their voices through 2 9-year vintage children, who possessed expertise that confounded each rational explanation. Dawn broke gray and bloodless over Pine Hollow, bringing with it a delegation of officials from the county seat. Phrase of the preceding days, discoveries had traveled rapid, and Solicitor Brennan had wasted no time in contacting the government. By Meetum morning, the small agreement determined itself host to a county sheriff, a territorial judge, and 2 federal marshals who have been investigating the disappearances of vacationers alongside the mountain trails for years. Judge Harrison, a stern guy with silver hair and piercing gray eyes, had set up his transient courtroom inside the church itself, a desire that struck Pastor Phillips as grimly appropriate given the building's blood-soaked records. The complete network were summoned to attend what would amount to each hearing and reckoning. Elder Thompson, his fitness visibly deteriorating below the weight of his confessions, sat inside the front pew, flanked by means of two different elderly men who have been a part of the unique leadership council. Their faces bore the whole appearance of men who had carried terrible secrets and techniques for too lengthy, but it turned into the Morrison twins who commanded the most attention. Choose Harrison had to begin with been skeptical of claims that youngsters possessed supernatural know-how, but the previous day's discoveries had compelled him to rethink. He had spent the morning interviewing them one by one, trying to determine how they could probably realize details about crimes that predated their births. Rebecca Morrison, Choose Harrison stated, his voice echoing inside the wood church. Please tell this court precisely how you understand the vicinity of Marcus Webb's non-public consequences. Rebecca stood within the witness region, searching impossibly small underneath the weight of adult interest. Faith Whitman told me in a dream. She stated without a doubt. She said the men who killed her circle of relatives have been the equal ones who killed the tourists. She desired all and sundry to recognize the reality. And also you, Rachel Morrison? The Choose persisted. How do you understand details about activities that passed off years earlier than your birth? Rachel's voice turned into barely audible as she answered, the goals come to each folks. We see what happened as if we have been there. We see the concern in people's eyes. We hear their remaining phrases. We experience their pain. Judge Harrison leaned forward in his chair. Are you claiming to talk with the spirits of the dead? Ezekiel Morrison rose from his seat. Your Honor, if I may additionally, my daughters have by no means claimed to apprehend their competencies. They honestly report what they enjoy. I've witnessed them offer accurate information approximately dozens of communities we have visited, data they couldn't in all likelihood have received through ordinary method. Sheriff Mackenzie, a realistic man greater involved with evidence than supernatural claims, addressed the twins at once. Are you able to tell us what number of people had been killed alongside these mountain trails? Rebecca and Rachel exchanged certainly one of their significant glances earlier than Rebecca replied. 11 guys over 3 years. Maximum were touring by myself, with cash for land purchases or enterprise ventures. One was a preacher like Papa, but he carried gold coins sewn into his saddle. The specificity of their answer sent murmurs through the assembled crowd. Rachel endured in which her sister left off, their tag team shipping as unsettling as always. The preacher's call changed into Samuel Collins. He changed into going to establish a brand new church in Tennessee. His horse turned into a bay mare with a white star on her forehead. Sheriff Mackenzie consulted a worn pocketbook he had pulled from his coat. His face grew pale as he observed the access he changed into looking for. Samuel Collins disappeared alongside this path in September of 1819, he confirmed. The description of his horse matches our statistics exactly. However, it turned into what passed off next that could shake everyone present to their very core. Elder Thompson, his palms trembling with age and guilt, struggled to his feet. Your Honor, he said, his voice cracking, I will bear this burden now not. What these kids say is authentic. Every word of it. But there's something else. Something worse than the murders we devoted. The church fell silent, except for the sound of wind through the loose boards and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. The Whitman circle of relatives. Thompson endured, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. They didn't just come across proof of our crimes. Jacob Whitman became my brother-in-law. I confided in him about what we have been doing. Questioning own family loyalty could preserve him quiet. However, Jacob had a judgment of right and wrong stronger than his loyalty. Pastor Phillips felt the sector tilting around him as Thompson's confession opened up. Jacob threatened to expose us all until we made restitution to the households of the useless. He stated he might journey to Lexington himself and record our crimes to the territorial authorities. We couldn't permit that occur. Too many families trusted what we had constructed right here. Thompson's voice dropped to a whisper. On the night of December 21st, 1818, We followed the Whitman-owned family to the church. Rebecca had grown very nonetheless at some stage in Thompson's confession. Her young face faded, however, decided. "Tell them about the infants," she stated quietly. Thompson's composure cracked absolutely. "Pricey God," he sobbed. "How should you understand about the toddlers? Choose." Harrison leaned ahead intently. "What baby? Give an explanation for yourself, Guy. Mary Whitman was with toddler while we killed her," Thompson stated, the words seeming to tear from his throat. 8 months in conjunction with twins. The health practitioner said they may have lived if we had gotten help, as opposed to, he couldn't end the sentence. Rachel stepped forward, her soft voice carrying definitely through the taken-aback silence. "That is why we can see everything so definitely. Religion and desire. Whitman weren't the only kids who died that night time. Their unborn sisters died with them. 4 souls crying out for justice." The theological implications of Rachel's statement dispatched surprise waves via the assembled crowd. If the twins have been, by some means, channeling the spirits of the lifeless Whitman kids, which include the unborn, it cautioned a information of the afterlife that challenged essential Christian doctrine. Dr. Hayes, the network's unofficial health practitioner, determined his voice. "I assisted with the burial," he stated slowly. "We determined evidence of the pregnancy, but we advised ourselves the babies were too younger to have souls, that they wouldn't need right burial rites. Every soul matters to God," Ezekiel Morrison stated firmly. "Every existence, irrespective of how short, has everlasting importance." But Choose Harrison became more worried with earthly justice than theological debate. "Mr. Thompson, are you confessing to the homicide of Jacob Whitman, his wife Mary, their twin daughters and unborn children?" "I'm," Thompson replied, his voice hollow with despair. "And to the murders of 11 vacationers who relied on us with their lives. We're all responsible, myself, Samuel Bradford and Marcus Perry. We planned it together. We carried it out collectively, and we've got hidden it collectively for 16 years. The 2 different aged guys named in Thompson's confession sat in greatly surprised silence, their faces mask of resignation and terror. The load of 16 years of collective guilt had eventually emerged as too heavy to bear. Sheriff Mackenzie stood and began putting the 3 men underneath arrest. However, Choose Harrison raised a hand to forestall him. "Earlier than we continue with formal charges," the judge said, "I need to understand how those youngsters may want to possibly understand info that have been never recorded, never spoken of, in no way shared out of doors the circle of perpetrators." Rebecca seemed up on the Choose with those unnaturally knowing blue eyes. "Your Honor," she said in her clear, childish voice, "a few truths are too big to live buried forever. The Whitman sisters and their unborn infants had been ready 16 years for someone to pay attention their story. But how do you pay attention them?" Defied, Harrison pressed. "What mechanism allows this communication?" Rachel joined her sister at the front of the church. "We do not understand it any more than you do," she said, ever due to the fact that we had been very small. We have had dreams about locations we've in no way been, and people we've by no means met. Papa says our mama had the present of second sight, but what we enjoy is different. Distinct how? Rebecca and Rachel exchanged certainly one of their meaningful glances before Rebecca answered. Mama could feel matters approximately dwelling human beings, their feelings, their intentions, their hidden thoughts. But we see beyond that. We see the echoes that tragedy leaves in the back of, especially while innocent blood is spilled. Ezekiel Morrison had been taking note of his daughters with developing challenge. "Your Honor," he said, "I've spent years seeking to understand my daughter's capabilities. I've consulted with ministers, docs, and students in the course of Kentucky and Tennessee. None can give an explanation for it, however all have witnessed its accuracy." Defied Harrison was quiet for an extended second, studying the twins with a combination of fascination and unease. "Miss Rebecca." "Omit Rachel," he said eventually, "in case you clearly possess this gift. Then possibly you could tell us wherein the bodies of the opposite sufferers were disposed of." The question hung inside the air like incense smoke, heavy with implication. If the twins could locate the stays of Marcus Webb and the alternative murdered travelers, it'd offer the very last proof needed to near instances that had baffled government for years. Rebecca closed her eyes as if paying attention to something handy as she may want to listen. Some are within the vintage mine shaft east of city, she stated after a moment. Others have been thrown into Satan's Creek, where the modern day runs private, but 3 have been buried beneath the church floor, their bones mixed with the foundation stones. The revelation that 3 murder sufferers have been interred below the church itself dispatched a collective shudder through the congregation. Pastor Phillips found out with horror that he had been accomplishing offerings, celebrating communion and offering prayers for salvation, even as standing at once over the unmarked graves of harmless guys. Sheriff Mackenzie appeared to decide Harrison for root. Your Honor, if we're to verify those claims, we will want to excavate the church floor itself, and we are able to decide, Harrison answered grimly. But first, I want to understand the whole scope of these crimes. He became back to Elder Thompson. Where is the cash stolen from those victims? What changed into carried out with their possessions? Thompson gestured weakly in the direction of the church building round them. The whole thing went into building our community. The church, the school, the mills, it all became constructed with blood cash. We informed ourselves we had been developing something top from something evil, that God would forgive us if we used the cash for righteous functions. And the sufferers' households, Decide Harrison asked, did any of you take into account the wives, youngsters, mother and father, who never discovered what occurred to their loved ones? It was Rachel who spoke back, her young voice sporting a weight of unhappiness that seemed inappropriate for her age. Marcus Webb had a wife named Elizabeth and 2 younger sons. Samuel Collins turned into engaged to be married to a female named Catherine, who waited for him until she died of consumption 3 years later. Maximum of the others had families who spent years thinking, hoping, grieving without closure. The specificity of her knowledge about the sufferers' personal lives become possibly the maximum unsettling element of the entire ordeal. These weren't just names and dates. The twins referred to the murdered guys as though they'd recognized them, in my view, as if they carried the weight of their unfulfilled dreams and abandoned obligations. Decide Harrison stood and addressed the assembled crowd. This courtroom will recess while we conduct a thorough investigation of the claims made here these days. Sheriff Mackenzie will coordinate the excavation of the church ground, and the quest of the place is recognized via the Morrison children. Elder Thompson, Samuel Bradford, and Marcus Perry will remain in custody pending formal prices. As the 3 elderly guys have been led away in shackles, the congregation began to disperse in shocked silence. 16 years of cautiously maintained lies had crumbled in a single morning, leaving a community to grapple with the expertise that their entire foundation turned into built on murder and deceit. But for Pastor Phillips, the most annoying questions remained unanswered. How should 9-year antique kids possess knowledge that defied every herbal regulation? What did their skills suggest about the character of demise, the endurance of awareness, and the possibility of conversation between the living and the dead? The Morrison twins stood collectively in the emptying church, their small figures dwarfed by using the significance of what they'd found out. They regarded worn out, drained by way of the emotional weight of channeling a lot ache and injustice. Papa, Rebecca said quietly, "Are we able to leave now?" The voices have become louder, and it's hard to maintain all of them instantly. Ezekiel Morrison collected his daughters close, his weathered face displaying deep concern for the load they carried. Soon, he promised. However, first, we need to assist these humans recognize what you have proven them. As the sun reached its zenith over Pine Hole, casting sharp shadows throughout the church cemetery and the excavation website behind the building, the community prepared for revelations that could task everything they thought they knew approximately. Justice, redemption, and the eternal outcomes of earthly moves. The reality become in the end emerging from 16 years of darkness. However, with it got here questions that would haunt everybody gift for the relaxation in their lives. The excavation of Pine Hole's church floor took 3 days. Running methodically underneath, Decide Harrison's supervision, Sheriff Mackenzie's group eliminated the wood planks and started out carefully digging through the packed earth underneath. What they found confirmed the Morrison twins' claims with chilling accuracy. 3 entire skeletons lay buried below the sanctuary, their bones indeed combined with the muse stones as Rebecca had defined. Personal outcomes determined with the stays matched descriptions from missing character reports, Relationship returned to 1818 and 1819. A gold ring bearing the initials JP belonged to Joshua Patterson, a land surveyor who had disappeared at the same time as mapping territorial boundaries. A silver dealt with knife turned into recognized as belonging to William Morse, a service provider whose circle of relatives had searched for him throughout 3 states. However, it became the 0.33 set of remains that furnished the most annoying confirmation of the twins. Not possible knowledge. Wrapped across the skeleton's neck, turned into a specific copper go that had been defined in awesome detail by means of the own family of Robert Chen, a journeying minister who had vanished at the same time as wearing donation money for a new church in Tennessee. As every piece of evidence was carefully catalogued, the scope of Pinehole's crimes have become undeniably clean. This had no longer been an unmarried act of determined violence. However, a calculated marketing campaign of homicide and robbery that had lasted for years. Decide Harrison, his silver hair seeming to have gained extra gray at some stage in the research, addressed the reassembled network on the 4th day. "The evidence earlier than this courtroom is overwhelming," he announced. 11 guys were murdered along these mountain trails between 1818 and 1820. Their killers used the stolen cash to build this agreement, then compounded their crimes with the aid of murdering the Whitman circle of relatives to guard their mystery. Elder Thompson, Samuel Bradford, and Marcus Perry stood before the Decide in shackles, their faces displaying the hollow exhaustion of men who had carried insufferable guilt for too lengthy. At their superior a while, they knew they would in no way live to peer freedom once more. The most traumatic factor of those crimes, Decide Harrison endured, isn't their brutality, however their calculated nature. These guys didn't kill in ardor or desperation. They created a systematic approach for identifying and murdering vacationers, then used their victims' money to build what they supplied as a godly network. Pastor Phillips listened to the Choose's words with a growing sense of non-secular disaster. The whole lot he had devoted himself to serving the church, the community, the shared religion that sure them collectively had been constructed on a foundation of harmless blood. How ought to he maintain to minister in an area so thoroughly corrupted through evil? However, it was the Morrison twins who provided the maximum profound perception into the non-secular implications of Pinehole's crimes. "Judge Harrison," Rebecca stated, her clear voice wearing easily through the packed church, "may additionally we communicate approximately forgiveness." The Choose seemed down at the 9-year vintage lady with a mixture of amazement and recognize. After 3 days of witnessing, her not possible know-how proved accurate in each detail. He had found out to listen cautiously to whatever she said. "Of direction, toddler, what would you like to say?" Rebecca and Rachel moved to stand together on the front of the church under the wood, move that had presided over 16 years of collective deception. The Whitman sisters want anybody to recognize that they forgive the men who killed them. Rebecca stated they remember that fear makes human beings do terrible matters. Rachel endured the concept as she so often did. However, forgiveness does not erase consequences. The guys who dedicated those crimes need to face earthly justice, and the network must find a way to make things right with the households of the victims. Decide Harrison nodded solemnly. The court docket has the same opinion with that evaluation. Elder Thompson, Samuel Bradford, and Marcus Perry will face trial for a couple of counts of murder and robbery. However, what of the community itself? What of the church and buildings constructed with stolen money? It changed into Ezekiel Morrison, who responded, his weathered face reflecting deep concept. "Your Honor, in Scripture we find that the sins of the fathers want not be visited upon the youngsters. If the children choose righteousness over convenience, this community can be redeemed, but best via confession, restitution, and actual repentance." Pastor Phillips found his voice for the first time since the research commenced. "The church building itself should be consecrated anew," he said firmly. "We'll remove and well bury the stays discovered under the floor. We're going to identify and compensate the victims' families to the volume feasible, and we will set up a memorial to make certain those crimes are never forgotten." Solicitor Brennan, who had been documenting the entirety for his prison information, looked up from his notes. "The Marcus Webb property on my own is entitled to sizable restitution. His brother has legal me to pursue full healing of the stolen price range, plus damages for 16 years of family anguish. Elder Thompson, regardless of his shackles and failing health, managed to talk. The money is long past, he said quietly, spent over time on community enhancements, character circle of relatives' desires, church renovation. We have nothing left to present. Then the network itself bears obligation. Choose Harrison declared, the homes built with stolen cash will be bought. The proceeds disbursed to victims' households as partial restitution. Pine Harlow will efficiently cease to exist as a settlement. The consequences of the judge's decision struck the assembled crowd like a bodily blow. Families who had spent 16 years building lives in Pine Hollow might lose their homes, their church, their complete community shape. Kids would be uprooted, elderly residents displaced, a generation of stability destroyed by way of the crimes of their leaders. However, it became Rebecca Morrison who supplied the most chilling final revelation. Judge Harrison, she stated, her young voice carrying an authority that appeared impossible at her age. There's something else you need to realize, approximately Pine Hollow. The crimes didn't stop in 1820. The church fell silent, except for the sound of wind via the free boards and the distant thunder of a drawing close hurricane. What do you imply, child? Choose Harrison asked. Even though his tone cautioned, he wasn't certain he desired to realize the solution. Rachel improved to face beside her sister. The mine shaft wherein some of our bodies have been thrown. It is not simply an area wherein antique crimes have been hidden. People are nonetheless disappearing alongside these mountain trails. Sheriff Mackenzie straightened in his chair. Are you announcing these murders have persisted? No, not the equal humans, Rebecca clarified. Most of the original killers are too antique now. But others learned from their example, the techniques, the locations, the methods of doing away with proof. Understanding like that does not die with its creators. The consequences of her statement dispatched surprise waves through the assembled crowd. If the twins had been correct, Pinehole's crimes had spawned a subculture of violence that had persevered for many years, claiming extra sufferers whose disappearances were attributed to herbal dangers. Judge Harrison rose from his chair, his face grim with dedication. Sheriff Mackenzie, we will need to amplify our research straight away. If there are more recent crimes related to this region, we must discover them all. Because the felony lawsuits persisted around them, the Morrison twins stood quietly together, their impossible burden finally lifted after 3 days of revelation and testimony. That they had served as voices for the useless conduits for justice denied, devices of truth that could now not be suppressed. Ezekiel Morrison accumulated his daughters near, his weathered face showing deep comfort blended with concern for what lay ahead. Are you equipped to leave this vicinity? He requested gently. Rebecca regarded across the church one very last time, her blue eyes taking inside the wood walls, the easy pass, the faces of people whose lives have been for all time changed by her testimony. The voices are quieter now, she said softly. Religion and wish can rest. Rachel nodded, her hand locating her sister's. But there could be other places, different voices. Papa, why will we must bring all this disappointment? Ezekiel knelt down to his daughter's degree, his eyes vivid with unshed tears. I don't know, babies, but I accept as true with God gives unique burdens simplest to the ones strong enough to endure them. Perhaps you're present. Anything that's miles serves a motive larger than any folks can apprehend. As the Morrison circle of relatives organized to go away Pine Hollow, taking their mysterious skills and terrible information with them, Pastor Phillips located himself facing the maximum hard selection of his ministry. Need to he live and assist rebuild what can be salvaged from the network's ruins? Or must he flee from an area so very well tainted through violence and deception? The solution came as he watched the twins walking hand in hand toward their father's facet. If 9-year-old youngsters should undergo the burden of such devastating fact with grace and forgiveness, possibly there has been hope for redemption even in the darkest locations. 3 weeks later, Pine Hole turned into a ghost city. The church building were dismantled board via board, its substances bought to help compensate victims' families. The network's residents had scattered to different settlements throughout Kentucky and Tennessee, wearing with them the know-how that their complete bases have been constructed on innocent blood. But in churches throughout the vicinity, a new tale started out to spread. The tale of young girls who possessed know-how that defied rational explanation, who served as voices for the lifeless and gadgets of lengthy, delayed justice. Some brushed off the tale as frontier superstition. Others embraced it as proof of divine intervention in human affairs. The Morrison-owned family persisted their circuit through the faraway church buildings of Appalachia, and reviews endured to observe them. Communities experiencing non-secular renewal, long-buried secrets coming to light, mysteries solved through not-possible expertise possessed via twin ladies who spoke with the authority of prophets, regardless of their tender age. Choose Harrison's final document on the Pinehole investigation filled 47 pages and documented crimes spanning extra than a long time. His concluding paragraph would be quoted in criminal texts for generations. This case challenges our fundamental assumptions about the character of justice, truth, and the staying power of ethical accountability beyond the grave. While technology cannot provide an explanation for the source of the Morrison children's expertise, the accuracy of their testimony cannot be disputed. Possibly a few truths are indeed too critical to remain buried forever. Pastor Phillips eventually mounted a new ministry in Jap, Tennessee, where he spent the remainder of his profession, supporting communities confront difficult truths and are trying to find authentic redemption. He in no way forgot the 3 days in Pine Hollow, while two Dean Reinery antique girls had torn apart 16 years of cautiously built lies with expertise that no dwelling person need to have possessed. The mystery of Rebecca and Rachel Morrison's competencies turned into in no way solved. Medical experts of the technology had no framework for know-how. They're not possible understanding, and religious authorities have been divided on whether or not their gifts represented divine blessing or something some distance extra complex. What remains undisputed is the ancient report of their accuracy. Every element they revealed approximately Pinehole's crimes proved accurate. Every area they diagnosed yielded the proof they claimed would be discovered. Each mystery they uncovered was confirmed through impartial investigation. But perhaps the most unsettling issue of their story is not what they discovered about the past. However, what they suggested approximately the character of justice itself. If the dead certainly cannot relaxation, whilst their murders continue to be hidden, if innocence possesses a few strength to go beyond loss of life and call for accountability, then perhaps our expertise of ethical effect extends some distance past the limits of earthly existence. The Morrison twins vanished from ancient facts sometime in the 1840s. Their destiny is mysterious as their abilities. A few say they persisted their father's ministry until their own deaths, serving as instruments of fact in communities across the Yank frontier. Others believe they finally learned to suppress their terrible present and lived quiet, ordinary lives a long way from the circuit churches wherein their recognition had been hooked up. However, inside the far-flung corners of Appalachia, in settlements wherein antique secrets still fester and ancient crimes stay unpunished, tourists from time to time document encountering twin sisters who possess know-how no dwelling character must have. They communicate of the lifeless with informal familiarity, display truths which have been buried for generations, and remind the guilty that a few styles of justice go beyond the constraints of mortal law. Whether or not those encounters constitute the same Morrison twins, their religious legacy, or something else totally remains a mystery that science can't solve and faith cannot completely explain. What we know with reality is that reality, like energy, can neither be created nor destroyed. Simplest converted from one country to some other. And from time to time, simply every so often, it unearths voices willing to speak for those who can no longer talk for themselves. The files on the Pinehole research stay in the Kentucky Kingdom Archives, available to researchers who wish to verify the superb claims made in this account. Choose Harrison's meticulous documentation, Sheriff Mackenzie's proof reviews, and Pastor Phillips's personal journals all corroborate the critical information of this situation. However, the deeper mystery, the query of ways 9-year vintage youngsters could possess not possible know-how and function voices for the useless, remains as unsolved nowadays because it became in 1834. A few truths, it appears, are destined to remain beyond the attain of human know-how, dwelling in that shadow land among faith and motive, wherein the most profound mysteries of existence keep to elude our grasp. Do you agree with the Morrison twins? Surely communicated with the spirits of murder sufferers. Do you suspect their expertise could be defined via herbal method? We simply don't recognize. The evidence helps their accuracy. However, the supply of their competencies remains one among records' most compelling unsolved mysteries. What's your idea approximately the Morrison twins? Share your mind within the feedback underneath. Are you brave sufficient to keep in mind the possibility that dying isn't always the stop of awareness? Or do you accept as true what there is a rational explanation for their not possible information? Recall to subscribe for extra mysteries that task the entirety we think we understand approximately reality, and hit that notification bell so you by no means pass over tales like this one. Until subsequent time, take into account that some secrets and techniques refuse to stay buried forever, and occasionally the most harmless voices bring the most devastating truths.